Dr. Shrimali, ladies and gentlemen. In the two previous talks in this series, I attempted to lay before you my concept of what education, in the sense of cultivation of the individual mind to its possible perfection, signified, and to indicate and explain briefly the 6 principles which, in my opinion, should be observed in all educational planning. They were principles which seemed to me to hold true of all education, as they, so I maintained, flowed out of the very essence of the educational process. But all education is not education for all. All education is not organized by politically organized society, the state. The expenditure of resources in all education is not shared by all its citizens. All education is a very comprehensive category and would include many educational activities and many educational institutions which may be intended only for particular persons or group of persons in a society. Mankind have had education of some sort throughout their history, but except as in the early tribal stage of their life, when education was synonymous with living and was not assigned to a special separate agency, education has, I guess, seldom been for all. It has been for the few that had leisure, the few that had wealth, the few that ruled, or with the introduction into life of the religious ideas of human brotherhood, also the few who chose to devote themselves to the rather extraordinary activity of storing their minds with knowledge and were supported in that enterprise by the material assistance of those who had resources to spare. The problem those ages had to tackle was the problem of educating a class of individuals, never by any means too large in a community, the ruling class, the professional class, or the class of those who did not have to work for their living. The problem was usually handled by the class for itself and not by the community as a whole. The problem of the modern state is one of educating all its citizens to a sense of nationhood and to enable them to fill a place worthily in it. It is the radically changed circumstances of modern times, the growing complexity of social organization and industrial life, the pressing urgency of creating new social organs to ensure the unity and efficiency of the people that have caused this new and in all conscience stupendous task of education for everybody, education for all the children of all the people, and not only children at that. No wonder that the states providing education for all children and requiring them to take it have not a very long history. Introduced first perhaps in Germany, it has even there a history of just about 250 years. In the United States of America, compulsory school attendance laws are only in some states just a little over 100 years old. In most other lands, it has even a briefer history. It may interest you to know that during the last 3 decades of the 19th century, when the states of the American Union were going through the process of passing compulsory education laws, opponents of the legislation succeeded in convincing certain sections that compulsory education laws were not only Prussian in origin, but were instruments of despotism that should have no place in the statute book of a free government. I myself had the personal experience of having a long discussion with the distinguished director of education on a committee set up to consider the scheme of universal, free and compulsory basic education in the late 30s. Why universal and why compulsory came the rather abrupt and angry question. And before I and some of my colleagues could recover from the original shock, he chided us with a ring of righteous indignation. These men proposed to begin with compulsion for all in a country looking forward to be free. I argued at length with him in an unequal contest. Unequal for me, for he was much cleverer than I. Unequal for him, as he was in a committee that did not see his way. I remember that the director, an able scholar, a conscientious administrator, and a patriot to the bone, remained an unconvinced, sullen, solitary Protestant till the end. Many in his generation and in his class of highly educated intellectuals could not easily reconcile themselves to this rather newfangled business of the education of all the children of all the people. Literacy perhaps, yes, but education for all was not acceptable without serious doubts and questionings. But one does not have to argue long with you, I trust, to establish that the social, political, and economic changes that have happened in recent decades, that are happening with accelerated speed before our very eyes, and promise to happen even faster in the immediate future, leave no choice but for the state to recognize the right of every citizen to at least a certain minimum of education and his duty to take it. Especially in the particular situation of our country, which is striving to build up a structure of democratic living in a secular welfare state, the need for this education for all is absolutely essential. For a democratic society does not only have to work for the realization of ideas and plans prescribed by others, but each one of its citizens has to contribute as a fraction of the national arbiter in the framing of the design of national life. A democracy, I need not remind you, has to rely on individual initiative and not on direction from above. Its discipline is self-discipline and not an imposed discipline. Cooperation, persuasion, and exercise of disciplined initiative depend on mutual understanding and large-hearted toleration, which are essential conditions of democracy. One of its most difficult tasks is that of educating every citizen to the sense of a common national ethos. It's a problem which a democratic society, by the choice of the basic principles of its constitution, by the choice of its distinctive way of life, cannot escape. For the very choice of those basic principles generate centrifugal forces which may easily tend to disintegrate and disrupt democracy as a social order. The democratic state has to do something to keep itself together. The most potent instrument it has for this purpose is education. We should, however, remember that the purpose of a state can be short-sighted or far-sighted, that it can be obsessed with the immediate or be mindful of the ultimate. It can aim at the growth of moral freedom or aim at its destruction. If the aims of the public education system are to be determined by an absolute, all-powerful, tyrannical state that introduces compulsory education for all its citizens within a certain age range and prescribes for them their schooling as it prescribes for them their life, then we cannot get from the aims and purposes it sets for its schools anything that can be helpful in the understanding of their true educational significance. No imposed pattern, arbitrarily stamped on a living moral being, however efficient by certain standards, can be education as we have defined it. If, however, the state modestly and quite rightly regards itself as an evolutionary stage towards the perfect moral state, whose constant endeavor it is to pave the way to the development of a free moral personality for its citizens, and through their maximal individual development and their active and willing cooperation, itself to grow into the true and just constitutional state, then the state can legitimately set the aims for its schools. A state that incorporates the moral ideal is itself the highest moral entity. For it is then the condition precedent for the individual citizen being able to realize his goal of becoming a fully developed, free moral personality. The citizen and the state become mutually fructifying. By endeavoring to make the state approach its moral ideal, the citizen avails himself of the best opportunity to achieve his own perfection. I know that this is not true of all manifestations of the idea of the state. Some are positive and powerful hindrances to the attainment of the goal of a free moral personality. The state then tends to become the absolute evil, as indeed some great minds have characterized it. But one may not lose hope in the destiny of mankind by refusing to believe in the possibility of their organizing a system of social and political living together that would partake of the ideal of the just and impartial, the good and the benevolent state. To educate a person as a true citizen is to make him the instrument of helping his state to become the realization of the ethical idea of the just state. It will be no true education to harden the citizen into habits and ways of thinking and doing and reacting that would render the present imperfect state indifferent or hostile to its own evolutionary growth and satisfied with its present defects, consuming in the process of living all the good elements in its constitution and leaving behind but a dark and dismal precipitate of the absolute evil, in which the roots of nothing good can find their nourishment. A good state, mindful of its moral destiny, has two kinds of aims before it. Firstly, the egoistic aim of peace and security inside, defense against aggressors to assure its continued existence, and care of the physical and moral well-being of its citizens. And secondly, the establishment of the one human world or the federation of mankind, by itself growing morally to be an effective instrument of bringing it about in cooperation with like-minded peoples. If this good state takes over the education of all the children of all its citizens, it can be justly expected to educate them to contribute, each according to his natural individual capacity, towards the attainment of these two ends. Why else should it take the responsibility of educating all boys and girls? And why may it require all boys and girls to receive this education? The state educates to get good and useful citizens fit to pursue its twofold purposes. It educates with a utilitarian and an ethical motive. Keeping the twofold objectives of the state in view, one could say that the compulsory public school will have the following objectives. Number one, the first thing it will aim at will be to educate the citizen for some useful work, for a definite function in society commensurate with his capacity and aptitude. Its first aim is vocational or professional education, or as thorough a preparation for it as possible within the age limitations prescribed for compulsion. This is a utilitarian objective, but it is the basis of the moral and educational work of the school. I think I did well in mentioning that in these terms in the beginning. The second aim will be to make of education a moral experience and to bring home to the educand as vividly as possible that a vocation is not only a source of earning a living, but is indeed an office of public service in an organized, cooperative community and should be placed in the service of the growth and development of a moral social order. The third aim of the compulsory public school will be to awaken in the growing members of society the desire and to develop in him the strength to make a start on the long and enchanting journey of building up his own moral personality and to apply it to the moral perfection of the society to which he belongs. It will make him realize that the cherished ideal of the morally perfect society can advance towards its realization only by the harmonious working together of morally free persons. Let us now straight away get to the schools we should set up to achieve these three objectives. How can the school serve the first function of equipping its pupils for their station in life? If society is simply organized as society was in the Switzerland of Pestalozzi's day, or like the rural village society that almost exclusively engaged Gandhiji's thinking, the school could do a great deal to prepare its pupils for their vocation. The onrush of industrial development in the country makes the task more complicated. But we should not let that complication mislead us. No school, perhaps, can in a period of 7 or 8, which at the moment is the only possibility we might consider, give all the requisite training for the professional life of the pupils. It should then be in a position to give them as much preparatory skill in mental and manual operations as would be required for their filling in their place in society efficiently and well. By far the greatest majority of those who will go out of those schools will have to fill a place where manual work is the predominant activity. A theoretical book school will, as is now too patently known, not be the school to fit this vast majority of our boys and girls for their station in life. The school meant for them should be a school where manual work is the chief instrument of the educative activity. For those who have to fill the comparatively smaller number of intellectual occupations, one could suggest a different focus for the schools. But beyond the presumptuous belief of intellectuals that their progeny must also necessarily be intellectual, there is no easy method of sorting out this variety from the great mass of children who show quite unmistakably their active, practical proclivities. The school, therefore, that we set out to establish will have to be a school of work, mental or manual, until such time as the pure breed of theoretical intellectuals can be reliably sorted out at that age, a school where manual work shall be the center of educational activity. I have, I hope, clearly enunciated in my second lecture that mental work is an essential and a most important part of educative manual activity. This school of manual work can therefore serve as an effective base of education for vocations of both the manual and the intellectual type. When properly organized, it would be a good school both for the rural and the urban population, both for agricultural and industrial occupations, both for subsequent manual or intellectual fields of activity. It will have equipped its pupils as they go out of it with habits of work, of logical thinking out of their work in numerous problem-solving activities, of carefully reflecting on the possible means of doing their work, of doing the work undertaken with the best possible care, of exercise in subordinating their subjective whim to the logic of the object, of expressing the joy of aiming at and achieving a degree of perfection, and finally, of learning the sure way to better success by the self-criticism of their achievement. This is perhaps more than most of us have managed to get from a much longer schooling than what we propose to require of and provide for our children in a school of work. I have no doubt in my mind that a properly organized school of work will deliver the goods. That the work school we have so far established may not in general have achieved these results is only an indication that our generation has not been educated through the agency of work. I feel I must speak out about our efforts so far to establish such schools of work known as basic schools. My remarks will be based on my fairly extensive observations and on the impressions they have left on my mind. They are not the result of any objective study, I wish expressly to say. They do not cover the whole of India, but having some idea as to what a basic school might aspire to and reasonably hope to achieve, and having seen a fairly large number of stray samples, I venture to share with you my feeling that we have, by and large, not achieved what might have been easily attainable in properly organized schools of work. There are many reasons, mostly of an organizational nature, but there is one very important educational reason, and that is that in these schools, we have by and large not kept in view the essential educative condition of work as I attempted to describe these conditions at the last lecture. Just as we can turn so-called intellectual book schools into a mechanical memory training school, as we, God bless us, have succeeded in doing in hundreds of thousands of schools without a dog barking or without yet preventing their number from jumping up higher and higher, so we can and have in quite a few cases succeeded in making our work schools, the basic schools, a place of mechanical work. The work is extraneously and uniformly prescribed. There is no semblance of a spontaneous motivation in the child. He is supremely ignorant of any personal or social purpose behind his work. He starts with no interest, except perhaps curiosity and the appeal of doing something with his hands. He carries on as he is told to. He begins with no problem he has to solve. He naturally does not get any opportunity of thinking out his problems, for he indeed has none. He does not have to think out any possible alternative methods of solving the non-existent problem. He is told to do it in a certain prescribed way and is even denied even the simulated joy of a joint discovery with the teacher. He is occasionally made to work, usually not regularly, and those who make him do so are usually satisfied with any result. You would remember that this is the characteristic of casual occupation as I described it. And as I suggested, it is the business of education to pave the way to its transformation into earnest work, which insists on the best possible result and ever better result till perfection is realized. As a matter of fact, the teachers themselves show any interest in the result on the day the inspector or a VIP visits the school. The teachers know to classify these visitors. They know who considers basic education to be a fad and who still takes it a little more seriously. They don't show any work to the first variety, but arrange a meeting where the visitor is garlanded, a welcome song is sung, and followed by a report and a bhashan by the distinguished visitor, almost imperceptibly changing over to a tea. The basic education wala has, of course, to be shown some work, and that is duly done. One finds taklis and charkhas plying with suspiciously fair findings of fairly good yarn already on the takli or the spindle, frequently in the hands of pupils whose yarn is thick and uneven and breaks all the time you stand by him. It is the casual result of occasional activity being superimposed on the comparatively better results of a few boys or teachers who know to spin well. If the teacher senses that the visitor will be more impressed with the quantity of previous output than with the doubtful quality of the present result, and some of the cleverer teachers develop almost an electronic mind in this behalf, owing to the much too frequent visits of the VIPs, who usually don't have much else to do. He shows him a respectable heap on a table in the corner covered with a rather dirty piece of fine foreign cloth. If the visitor is curious or just wishes to show an intelligent interest and has no obsessive wishes, no obsessive dirt phobia, he perhaps lifts that conjurer's cloth and finds underneath it a tortuous, suffering, disintegrating, untwisting, dust-covered jumble of what perhaps once was some kind of earthwormish cotton yarn. Passing, it would appear in purgatory to get back to its original sinless, cozy state of being just a short staple cotton filament. These innocent filaments were taken away, so the elephant would, I guess, think, taken away from their blissful softness, vainly, aimlessly, almost maliciously by the boys and girls in the school under orders from their teachers. And just why? These filaments would have been happy if all the carding and the breaking and the twisting and the winding and the unwinding if after all this they had reached their destiny of becoming cloth to cover a naked back. That would have given this twisting and turning a meaning. That would have given the children's work a significance. The work as it was organized missed the one as much as the other. Work which is mechanical, work in which no mental exertion is involved, work in which one is satisfied with just any result, and there is no constantly prodding urge to aim at its possible perfection, work in which there is no self-criticism and so no real progress, is in no sense educative. Schools that have such work are not work schools in any real sense. There are the other organizational difficulties also. Let me mention just two. The basic schools are not infrequently treated as unwelcome intrusions in the placid atmosphere of Indian education. Boys and girls going out to the basic schools find it difficult, in some cases impossible, to get into other higher schools. So post-basic schools are established for their benefit, just a few and far between. Then when a boy finishes his post-basic school, he is not, after having finished 12 years of schooling in a government-sponsored school of a type which it is proclaimed is to be the future objective of all elementary and partly secondary education, that boy cannot go to a university. For universities cannot be asked by government to admit him. The universities verily are autonomous bodies. I am myself very jealous of the real autonomy of the universities, but I still wait to see a university refusing to admit boys and girls who are sent out in their 100,000 every year by the boards of secondary and intermediate education with their stamp, although according to most responsible university men themselves, they are not fit by any standard to profit by the education which the universities as at present doing their work can give. They tamely admit them, for verily they are autonomous bodies. But the boy from the post-basic school with 1 or in some cases 2 years more of total previous schooling is denied that privilege. This shows lamentable lack of coordination in educational work, and something must indeed be done soon about it. If many of the basic schools are even now considerably better places of education than other schools dealing with the corresponding age group of children, it is because the relationship with the surrounding life is less remote, and they tend to be organized as small educational communities with some common values. This practical work, whatever its educational shortcomings, is closer to their distinctive mental makeup in that period, and so the schools manage to develop some positive qualities. But we should not be satisfied unless we have made them real places of education through educative work. To do this implies a firm decision and an unmistakable will to follow it up to its perfection. Educational work in this should do its best to be like educative work. I wish in our educational work we had always before us the motto, also a very appropriate motto for a school of work: thinking and doing, doing and thinking. Thinking and doing, doing and thinking. There is no other way. Is it really not a pity that even today, after nearly 2 decades of the introduction of the idea of basic education to Indian educational thinking by no less a man than Gandhiji, there are important persons in the field of public education and public life, both amongst those who make policy and those who are responsible for its execution, who by what they say or leave unsaid, not in conferences, but in effective private asides, create a doubt whether we really want these schools of work. Something should be done to put an end to this also, if progress in basic education is not to be as slow, as uneven, and as educationally ineffective as I fear it has been. If the view prevails that the type of school is nothing for us, if the scheme is not sound or not feasible, by all means declare so and be done with it. That would be a more honest course to take. And I am sure that if that is done, the school of work will return to Indian education with enhanced vigor and be implemented more wholeheartedly and more thoroughly, and that perhaps soon. The greater danger to the school of work is the acceptance of the idea with 100 mental reservations and of discarding it by discrediting it by thoughtless, inefficient practice. Now, that was about the first objective. The first objective of the required public education can, as I hope I made quite clear, be attained by making educative manual work the main feature of that education. The second objective, namely the making of education a moral experience and a moral training, bringing home to the pupil the realization that the vocation one takes up is not merely a device for earning a livelihood, but really an office of public service in a cooperative community based on the division of labor, can be achieved, I submit, only by organizing our schools as communities of work and life. This community should stand out as the embodiment of moral ideals suited to the age of its members. This community of work, for instance, can stand for a noble-minded comradeship in the active finding out of the unknown and to the discovery of truth, natural and historical, in the appreciation and creation of beauty, in upholding standards of a clean life, in helping the helpless, in courageously speaking out one's mind, in accepting the duty of the best possible in accomplishing the tasks assigned, in the readiness to work for and to stand back, if necessary, for the good of the school community, to play for the team, and a number of other ideals can consciously form the basis of such a community. Work in such a community becomes service and builds up what is expressed by that carelessly bandied word, character. In the busy atmosphere of the community of work, with its varied and manifold fruitful contacts, a certain social sensibility and a certain delicacy of feeling will be developed, which are extremely valuable ingredients in the formation again of that character. Another quality, that of responsibility, will find a fertile field of growth in this community. Children who have experienced the unspeakable joy and the rewarding satisfaction of having worked in such a setup are bound to seek and find it in the work of later life. Experiments all over the world are being made to create such school communities. We shall have to do it if we take our education seriously. But we shall have to devise ways and means of doing this, not in the case only of rather expensive public schools, but in our schools of all the children of all the people. Our best educators should apply their minds to converting the compulsory Indian school into a real community of work. The third aim, that of initiating the process of self-education, of awakening in the pupil the desire with a degree of urgency to grow into a free moral person and to help in making the society to which he belongs a morally better society, can at best be started at the compulsory school in view of the stage of development of the child. To let the pupil go out of the school before, say, 14 is to give the school no chance at all to do this. The chief organizational question about this question with these objectives in view is who amongst the total population of the country should be selected for this. If we keep the three objectives in view, the lowest age group of children up to 7 years is obviously not to be selected. It represents the age of play, and play, as I have shown, is its own end and may not be put to use for the attainment of any of the three objectives. Could we select mature people, say at the age of 21, to go to the nation's institutions of required education for some time? It would indeed not be as ridiculous as it might at first sound. The needs of economic life will, however, come in the way, although some kind of an organization of required work under intelligent educative supervision in labor camps, for instance, might indeed do us a great deal of good. People would at least understand a little what they so endlessly prattle about. Provisions of this kind of labor or military camp service are used in many lands as effective reinforcement of the school in educating for intelligent citizenship and a disciplined national life. But our average of life being as low as it is, most of our countrymen might be deprived of this essential required education if you began too late, and may not have enough time left to them to put it to much use for the people. So we shall have to consider the two lower age groups, 14 to 21 and 7 to 14, both of which show certain characteristics generally true of the population in each group. The age period 14 to 21 might indeed be better for attaining the second and third objectives for which this required education, we said, was to be designed. It would take away from work members of society who would be very valuable for production. It would suffer from three serious defects. It would take away from work members of society who would be very valuable for production. It might involve a newly married wife and a small baby. And what is educationally more important, it would begin their education too late to take advantage of the eminently practical urges of childhood for training in the work of life, and the additional complication for educational organization of a very diversified manifestation of interests in heterocentric work in the various individuals of this group. The period of 7 to 14 seems to be the obvious tentative choice. But it might be said at the very outset that this required education should go up to 14 in any case. If the supporters of the view that the earliest years of life are the most important must be heard, and you must try to please them, then you might begin as early as would satisfy them, at birth if they shout loud enough. At 6, as we seem already to have agreed to do. If you begin at birth, please remember that you must plan for a minimum of 14 years of education. If you begin at 6, then for 8 years, as it appears is the national consensus. From what I regard as the raison d'etre of the required public schooling, it is in my view much more important to continue till a later than to begin at an earlier age. I am quite clear in my mind that if we plan to provide an 8-year compulsory education, then the 8 years from 7 to 15 would yield much better results than those from 6 to 14. But whenever you begin, to finish it earlier than 14 plus will be fatal to the purposes which justify any compulsory education in a free society. Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to keep ourselves reminded of even inconvenient commitments. You would know that there is a directive of the Indian Constitution that education to all boys and girls up to the age of 14 will be required and provided free within 10 years of the promulgation of the Constitution. The directive has wisely and far-sightedly omitted to mention the age at which the required education should begin. It has, however, expressly indicated the age up to which it shall be given and received. You know that we are nowhere near fulfilling the directive. Not even a distant prospect of its fulfillment is in sight. One is told that there are not resources enough for fulfilling it. I do not wish to quarrel with that view at the moment, but I do not subscribe to it either. Resources have been found and will continue to be found for many a thing for which there is no constitutional directive. To plan in a democracy is to plan in accord with the will of the people. The will of the people finds its most conclusive and clear expression in the Constitution the people give themselves. It must indeed be a matter of serious heart searching for anybody to plan to spend the resources of the people on anything at the cost of failing to comply with the directive in the Constitution. But as I said before, I do not propose to quarrel with the view that resources are not available. Conceded resources could not, for pressing reasons, be made available, and the whole age span 6 to 14 or 7 to 14 could not be covered, it is beyond me to understand why it should have changed to from 6 to 11 and not to 9 to 14. Look at the compulsory attendance laws of countries who take their education seriously. You would hardly find any that sends out its young from its compulsory free schools before the age of 14. There is a tendency to raise that age limit. In some it has already been raised to 15, 16, and even 18. You would find several who begin late, mostly at 7, quite a few at 8, and some even at 9. Nothing but a mechanical view of reducing by cutting the top, or the persistent obsession about the importance of the earlier years, as if any years in life were in some way or the other less important, or an indifference to specific aims and objectives of the compulsory education for all could have been responsible for this change. If resources are available only to provide free compulsory education over 5 years, I am quite definitely of the view that the 5 years should be from 9 to 14. This is the minimum that has to be provided, and if it must be reduced further, let us reduce it at the lower limit. But as I said, education up to 14 is the minimum for the attainment in some measure of the objectives of compulsory education. More is very urgently necessary. Countries which take their education seriously are alive to the fact that even a compulsory education period of nearly 8 years, ending with the age of 14, is by no means sufficient to enable the young citizen to be effective in his vocation and in fulfilling his obligations as a citizen, unless his education is continued further without taking away altogether from his work. The gradual decline in those countries of the supervised apprenticeship and a clear realization of the community's responsibility to provide education and guidance to young wage-earning citizens whose limited schooling is evidently an inadequate preparation for effective citizenship, and whose entrance into the vortex of life coincides with the difficult period of adolescence. Some 30 countries provide continuation education of some kind, and since my information is not up to date, the number might well be larger. India is not one of them. The Germans have been at it quite a long time. Their Vorbildungsschulen, or Berufsschulen as they were latterly called, became real places of education thanks to the work of George Steiner in Munich. His example was followed by many countries in Europe and by many states in the American Union. Originally provided for young people employed in manufacturing and commerce, they are being extended to those in agriculture, in mining, and in domestic service. Usually started as evening classes, they now usually insist on daytime attendance for a certain number of hours every week. The time spent at the continuation school being considered as time spent on work. There is much that needs to be done in Indian education, but first things must come first. There is some education which is meant for all children. The state must first see to it that this obligation is really met. At least a 7-year compulsory school of work, organized as a community with the 3 objectives I have indicated, transformed from a place of theoretical one-sidedness to that of practical human many-sidedness, from a place of passive book learning to one of active, purposeful work seriously planned, honestly executed, unsparingly criticized, and generously appreciated, supplemented after the age of 14 by continuation vocational institutes with compulsory part-time attendance up to 18th year of age, will have laid the foundation not only of sound education, but also of a sound and dynamic democratic society. It is work that the state naturally will take in hand, but its success will depend in a large measure on the teacher and on the Indian citizen. I should not be surprised if there be some teachers among my audience today. I am afraid, however, that there will not be many elementary or basic school teachers. They don't usually come to the Vidyan Bhavan. Thanks to the All India Radio, my words will, I hope, reach a number of teachers outside this hall. But again, not many elementary or basic school teachers. They don't usually listen to English broadcasts. But having been a teacher most of my life, and having had, by a strange constellation of circumstances, something to do with all stages of educational activity, from the kindergarten through the basic and secondary schools to the university, I have developed a sense of the oneness of the educational profession, which our caste-ridden society, unfortunately, tends to break up into watertight compartments. If by some magic I could create among those engaged in educational work that sense of oneness of a most intricately interconnected activity, I would not have lived in vain. But one must face the prospect, for where shall that magic come from? I wish, however, to address a few words to fellow teachers here, and through them to all the others spread over our vast land. There is nothing new that I can tell them. I've been saying that to teacher audiences all these 30 years and more. I wish to remind them of their immense responsibility towards the people engaged in the task of erecting an edifice of national greatness on the foundations of its hard-won freedom. Let them remember as educated persons who, as free moral personalities, ought to be concerned about the moral improvement of the society for which they work, that they are custodians of the highest values created and cherished by our people, themselves representing a fascinating composition of most of what is best in the cultures of mankind. If some of them have never experienced the blissful pain of having been stirred to the depths of their being by some of these values, their place indeed is not amongst the rank of the teachers. He who has never been so stirred, he who has never experienced any of the higher values to the degree of being almost possessed by them, at least momentarily, he who has been cold and holds out the depressing prospect of remaining cold with reference to any values beyond his poor little physical self, should really not think of becoming or remaining a teacher. A teacher has to help in the transmitting of higher values to his pupils through his personality and through the goods of culture which are his instruments. If he himself does not know them, has not experienced them, has never once heard their persistent call for realization, how can he transmit or enkindle them? The good teacher has, besides this, to be a character of what I have described as a social type in my first lecture. The essence of his work is the attempt to get values realized in other young persons as a result of sympathy for and understanding of the needs and gifts of those persons. His chief preoccupation is with immature growing lives, with personality as it were in the bud. He is to be guided in the influence he brings to bear on him by the characteristics of his ward. He has to help the bud into full bloom and not to make paper flowers to satisfy his whims. The growth of the morally autonomous personality is the aim and end of his endeavor. He may never use the cultural goods which are the tools of his work as impositions to make a slavish copy a cliché. The true teacher yearns to lead his people on to their inner moral freedom, which should enable them to work for the moral improvement of the ever incomplete society to which they and he belong, and to work for this end, which a good democratic society should always concede, even when he has to do so at the risk of being stoned to death by that society for performing this inescapable moral duty. Socrates and Christ and Hussein and Gandhi should not have lived and died in vain for him. The teacher's is not to dictate or dominate. His is to help and serve, to understand and shape in faith and love and reverence. It calls forth all his limitless love and all his inexhaustible patience to produce the proper adjustment between the individual and the group. The significance of each, as you know, has been exaggerated in turn. It is the teachers to harmonize them, while others dogmatize. The teacher knows. He knows that the individual is not just a unit of calculation, an identity card or a number. If the young he has to help to grow through work and knowledge and experience are not asking for a fuller and more satisfying life, each in his or her own specific way, then life itself perhaps is a fiction. On the other hand, he also knows that the group is not a mere aggregation of individuals or just a hypothesis convenient for purposes of organization. He knows that the individual comprehends life and gets the strength to change it through the group. But he knows also how easily the group can degenerate into an instrument of suppression. There is just some difference between the rhythmic march of happy, nimble feet and the ominous tramp of an invading army. To the teacher, it is this difference that seems to matter, and he feels that given the chance, he should help men to grow who will walk together with joy and work together with unflagging zeal for ends beyond themselves. Fellow teachers, for I guess I have not forfeited the right to address you thus, however much appearance might have changed, I do sincerely feel I belong to the fraternity. The sense of having served it and of identity with it, with what I believe to be its mission, gives me the strength to carry on yet a while. Fellow teachers, it's a tremendous challenge we have to face. Let us face it bravely. Let us not always wait till others think out things for us and we set out mechanically, soullessly to execute them. Let us evolve a healthy professional opinion, a high professional sense of national duty. We are not just wage earners making some sort of a living, as is the cruel fate of millions upon millions of our countrymen, by doing what we do not understand, by engaging in exhausting toil and work that has no significance for us, that gives our lives no meaning. We have to breathe the spirit of the intellect, of objective morality and social responsibility into the work of the hand, and to give to intellectual work a firm foundation of concrete, purposeful activity. I wish in the end to say a few words to my fellow citizens on behalf of the Indian school. Friends, I beg of you to give to your schools their rightful setting. The school does not exist in a vacuum. It is an integral and sensitive part of society. The school looks for example in the life of the society around and takes after it. I therefore ask for a spirit of general helpfulness and cooperation amongst you in all the enterprises of life, such as will make the school community ashamed to betray a lack of cooperative feeling. I ask for a spirit of mutual tolerance among you, so that the youth of the future will feel that in making room for its growth, in expressing and asserting itself in its own way, it is not asking for a privilege which the grown-up and effective members of society habitually deny to each other. Expression of individuality in social objectives, which is nothing but the provision for each to serve society in an effective manner, should not be a privilege that is extorted from reluctant hands, but a right that is freely given and joyfully enjoyed. I ask you, above all, for a harmonious working together of groups, big or small, based either on religion or language or caste or some other form of corporate selfishness. A school can be a small, exclusive community of members who cooperate in the interest only of the school, or acquire skills and habits which they utilize for their own personal benefit, giving to society no return for the opportunities it has provided for them. We do not want such schools. It's also possible that in a school, young boys and girls acquire a certain efficiency, but in afterlife serve the interests of a small group only, unwittingly or deliberately ignoring the wider human issues. We do not want such schools either. We should not wish to inculcate narrower at the expense of wider loyalties. It's only proper that you should want schools in which the individual members impose upon themselves the discipline necessary for the work of the school, and want them so to organize things that the school community as a whole has the feelings of serving the higher cause of the people, and beyond them, even serving human values in general, serving God. This ultimate, all-pervading loyalty as the highest value must come first. We can serve Him only by serving our people, our neighbors, our fellow men. In this, the school will look to you. If you cannot stand the test, if you cannot for your lives, by your lives, convince the school community that in your affection and your service, in your sympathy and your loyalty, you can transcend the narrow limits of personal and family interest, of group selfishness, then all else will not be of much avail. For the sake of the future of your land, for the sake of your children, to whom you would not easily deny anything, I beg you to create in the life that surrounds the schools, and which you, each one of you, does something to build up, that climate of opinion, those habits of helpfulness, cooperation, objectivity, of service and loyalty to the highest causes, in which alone the true school, like a true humanity, can thrive. The reconstruction of our educational work and the moral regeneration of the people are inextricably linked up. Let us set our hands courageously to both. Thank you.